Good morning to everybody. Thanks a lot to join us for this session that is particularly interesting today after the last news about the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. I'm war correspondent, so I was in Beirut 1 month ago exactly, and I am very happy today to see the news that people is coming back in the south in that specific moment. So we started this session with a title that is particularly interesting, that it's picking up the pieces and what the future for Middle East. The guests, we will try to picking up the pieces about the future of Middle East and after 13 months that were particularly dramatic for the region and has been one of the darkest page of the history of Middle East. I don't want to take time to the speakers that are Joseph Bahout, Director of Wissam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs of American University of Beirut. Thomas Gomart, Director, French Institute of International Relations. Rayed Krimli, Head of Policy Planning, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Saudi Arabia, and Geir Pedersen, UN Special Envoy for Syria. So we try to, I will ask it to be very, very briefly, understand that it's difficult. But first question, it's for Pedersen. And after a month of tragedies and bad news from the region, I ask to reflect on the challenges that the current Middle East crisis presented to international diplomacy in that moment, in particular to discuss about the importance of the role of the UN in the region.
How many hours do I have?
No, a few minutes, I'm sorry.
Listen, I think there is, let me start by this, that obviously what we are seeing now is a failure of international diplomacy. And what we are seeing is, of course, also that failure is based into the international system. Because we know that the international system to work requires the cooperation of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And if that is not happening, the system is from time to time breaking down. But let's recall that this is not the first time this is happening. Not that that should be any comfort. But if we go back to the immediate after the end of the Cold War, many of you here will remember what happened in Rwanda, where the international community sat silent and saw a genocide developing. Then we had, during the same period, we had what was happening in the former Yugoslavia. Of course, with the Dayton Accord, it was a positive outcome, but still, by and large, I think it was seen sort of as a breakdown at the time, also of the international community. Then, of course, what many of us will remember, the Iraqi war, and the fact that the Security Council to agree on what they were going to do, and the Security Council said no. But still, the Americans went ahead and invaded Iraq. A gross failure of the international community and international diplomacy. And then we could mention many other examples. But what we are seeing then is, of course, what happened in Ukraine, what is today, I think, happening in the Sudan. A gross tragedy. The latest news I heard from the Sudan was that 25 million people may be in danger of hunger and famine. 25 million people. And it's registered, but nothing is really happening. Then we have had the ongoing tragedy in Gaza, Lebanon, and of course, the conflict with Israel and Iran. And we have had also then, and we can talk about that later, increasingly Israeli attacks in Syria. And you may have heard Netanyahu yesterday directly threatening President Assad. So why I'm saying all of this? Because if we are to get out of this in a proper manner, we need to restore the cooperation within the international community. And if that is not happening, we will continue to struggle. And then the whole UN system will continue to struggle. But of course, it's not only about the P5. It's also about how the P5 is interacting with the region or not interacting with the region. And to be more precise, it's now the lack of American diplomacy in really connecting with the region and the crisis of the region. Of course, we're all pleased to see that there was a ceasefire in Lebanon, and God willing, that will be holding. But obviously, there are tons of challenges also related to that. But as of today, let's say yes, this is a great relief to the people, of course, in Lebanon. Sorry to be a little bit roundabout answering your question.
Thank you very much. So for the point of view from Saudi Arabia, what we can say, how international diplomacy has been working on the current crisis, and especially in that moment that we can see a change also in the future after Trump election. Can I ask you to explain us the strengths and the weakness of the current de-escalation efforts, please?
Thank you for having me. Of course, Saudi Arabia took a leading seat in trying to put some dynamic for diplomacy regionally and globally to resolve the current wars and to emphasize the need for ceasefires and then release of hostages and uninhibited flow of humanitarian aid, and then paving the way for real peace and lasting peace. However, everybody knows that for more than 13 months, as Mr. Peterson said, there is a clear failure of diplomacy and clear erosion of the credibility and effectiveness of international institutions and international actors. The UN, the Security Council, but also international law, international humanitarian law, the will of superpowers to bring peace. Let's not forget, this is the longest war in terms of the whole Arab-Israeli conflict. No other war lasted that long. And with all the atrocities that we see and the human suffering and destruction, targeting even UN institutions and personnel and peacekeepers, it is increasingly difficult to preserve what we all need, which is a rules-based international system.
Thank you.
Very good.
And so, Professor Bahout, I ask you to give us to help us to understand this escalation mechanism that has been in place for Gaza, for Lebanon, and behind. And I ask also if it's possible to help us to understand which are their limits.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, ISPI, for having us and for putting up this panel. I'll try to answer the broader question, and I'm happy that Ambassador Peterson has been bolder than I was daring to be. After what he said, I think we can go forward and say that we have to admit that the last year has really shown that international diplomacy is in a very bad shape, if not dead, almost dead. And I'll answer part of your questions. First of all, if you take the Lebanese case, which maybe I can say a few words about, one of the first things that you see which is an incredible paradox, is that everything was revolving about trying to implement a UN Security Council resolution that has been voted in 2006, the 1701. And everybody was on the table to try to do that except the UN. There was no UN envoy on that issue. There was no UN activity on that issue. It was left to the parties, to the local parties, and to one international actor, or 1.5 US and France, if we can say so. So this is one thing that is very significant, I think, illustrative of what the UN has become. Now, this is the UN. So what is left is a series of other initiatives that are often bilateral and etc. But here even also, there was a failure. And if you allow me, I would be more blunt and maybe bold by saying it was not only a failure, but it was a lack of willingness. I mean, let's face it, the US has left this war, as our Saudi friend and colleague has said, the longest war in the Middle East, go and fester for more than a year now, without really trying to do something. Let's face it. And if it tried to do, it was really not enforced by anything. And frankly, if you go back to the last 12 months of history, of this very dark history, at every turning point, one of the actors of the conflict very openly and willingly humiliated the US by ignoring things. I mean, I take two examples. Prime Minister Netanyahu was received at the White House 4 months ago with a clear plan, the Biden plan for Gaza. He left the White House with the promise that he would implement the plan, and the day after, Israel killed Haniyeh in Tehran. 24 of September, there was the UN Security General Assembly in New York. The French and the American put on the table a plan for a ceasefire in Lebanon that is now being implemented. The day after, Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah and went to a full-fledged war against Lebanon. I can't believe that the US tried to use a leverage and failed. I think it didn't try to use the leverage. Point 3, and I finish there. What has replaced that? It's a series of small, what I would call transactional deals. And I think that what we are seeing today in the region is a sort of prefiguration probably of what the Trump era will be in dealing with problems of the region. I would close on one reminder. The only probably positive step in the last 3 years that happened in the region was exactly a sort of transactional deal. I'm talking about the maritime border delineation between Lebanon and Israel, the gas agreement. This has not ended the conflict. It has not progressed on reaching a sort of political agreement. It was a business deal. And it was celebrated as a stark success by the US diplomacy and etc. Is this the kind of diplomacy with capital D that we are going to see in the region in the coming future? Maybe, but if so, I think that problems, big problems with capital P, will be also left over to fester for the years and the decades to come, with probably more possibilities and avenues for conflictuality. So I think that last call for the UN body and assembly and community, I think that this is a wake-up call. Yesterday evening with friends, we were talking about the iniquity and probably the uselessness of what the UN has become. Maybe it's an occasion to start seriously thinking about a deep reform of these mechanisms and of our international, let's say, grammar and diplomacy, because if not, I think that other problems on the planet will surface very quickly and will be left over the way that the Middle Eastern problem has been left over for now more than a year.
Thank you. And Professor Gomar, I will ask you about the role of France, of course, and that we have seen especially important also in the last hours, but also about the role of international diplomacy of European Union, that sometimes here especially we cannot perhaps understand how we can improve the role for Middle East, and not only, but especially for Middle East.
Well, it's always difficult for me to try to explain the position of France in the current context.
Yeah, no, of course, but to analyze, please.
I will try to do so by saying that of course, Lebanon is a very important topic for President Macron and his government, even if the situation is particular right now politically in France, as you certainly know. But it's a minor issue. I would prefer maybe to reflect and to echo to what was said by Guy and Joseph. I think that this ceasefire is a good news, but the title of our session is Picking Up the Pieces. It's a very small piece, in fact, regarding what has been described, and not only in the Middle East, Guy mentioned also Sudan, Ukraine. And for me, from a French point of view, precisely, what is very important is to try to understand, to try to defend international law and to understand properly, the interaction between theaters. Because I think it is at the core of our issue. If we try, to anticipate the future of the United Nations system. And to put things bluntly, I belong to those who say, especially in Europe, in France in particular, that what is happening in Gaza reflects on what is happening in Donbass and reciprocally. Consequences in Sudan, I could elaborate on that. And I think it's very important. Of course, the situation in Middle East is very bad, can be seen as desperate in many cases. But I think it's very important to understand, what is happening between theaters. I should also mention the Caucasus, because part of the links between what happened in Ukraine and in Middle East has also some effects, in Caucasus. So to echo to what was said by Joseph, I would follow him on one point. We had the feeling, seen from Europe, that to some extent the Biden administration tries to avoid an escalation in Ukraine, and to some extent allow an escalation, for what was done by Israel. So why? In fact, the basic answer is very clear, because behind, the escalation in Ukraine, to avoid this escalation, Russia escalated, and Russia is a nuclear power. Russia recently used, an intermediate missile to strike in Ukraine, which is one of a new turning point after having invited, North Korean troops. And to some extent, what is the reason why the US allow Netanyahu's government to escalate, to transform, the situation in Gaza to a war with Iran? It is because Iran should not become a nuclear power, in a sense. And I think that this balance is certainly the crucial point. I would also think that Trump administration will continue to support, this attitude of the Netanyahu government, and will be, as you said, Joseph, certainly very transactional.
Okay, thank you. So the second part, very difficult, pick up the piece from the ground. But I will ask to every guest from his point of view, obviously, in particular from the point of view we start with the UN, how it's possible to picking up, if it's possible to picking up the pieces of this puzzle.
Let me just very briefly remind us what the UN is. It's many different things. So obviously the first and foremost is peace and security. Second, it's a huge humanitarian operation. Thirdly, it's about the UN agencies, funds and program, it's development, it's climate change, all the issues related to this. And linked to that, of course, the international financial system, the World Bank and the IMF. Then fourth, and this is extremely important, we have what I would call the normative aspect of the UN. So it's about upholding, as you rightly said, the international order. It's the UN Charter, but it's also developing norms and developing the international legal system. That's also part of the UN. And all these parts of the UN system is under stress, no doubt about it. We are now, naturally enough, concentrating on international peace and security. But I see in my job, and I know many of the UN officials see the same, is we are now increasingly struggling on our second mandate, the delivering of humanitarian assistance. Frankly speaking, that should not be the case. You know, when we are seeing all the things that are happening around the world, that should be sort of at least one basis of cooperation. But here it's also important. The world is changing. Huh? So traditionally, this has been sort of the arena of the West, the Europeans and the Americans. This can no longer be the case. We need not to engage the Arabs, in particular the Gulf, but also China and others in this system. They need to feel ownership and also a responsibility. And then, of course, you know better than I, all the challenges now related to the development agenda. It's about debt. It's about feeling that there is not sharing of vaccines, COVID. And of course, it's about the lack of financing when it comes to climate change and all the challenges linked to that. So that's why I think there is, the sense is that we are really struggling. Then, of course, we saw suddenly that the ICC came on board and issued then arrest warrants. So whatever we think of that, at least part of the system is working. So that's why I think let's look at the whole picture and let's try to improve the whole picture. Then on peace and security, here I belong to, frankly speaking, the pessimist when it comes to reform. I don't see a change in the veto structure. We should have invited Stefan up here because he's more of an optimist on these issues than I am. But anyway, that doesn't mean, of course, that what we, all civil society, governments are doing, putting pressure on the permanent members to deliver. That is extremely, extremely important. So we, as the UN, will continue to do whatever we can. Stefan and I, we represent the Secretariat, and we are supposed to work in all of these areas. But we can't do it without the state system functioning. Remember, this is a system based on the cooperation between states. And we can't suddenly just create a new reality. That's not the way it's happening. But it's happening by recovering from the disaster in Rwanda, recovering from the disaster of Iraq, and hopefully it will be possible to recovering from the disaster in Gaza, in Lebanon, and God forbid that we see further escalation into Syria. I'm working on all of these 4 aspects.
Thank you. From the point of view of Saudi Arabia, and obviously having in mind also Abraham's agreement, that perhaps we see what will happen in the next few months. So picking up the pieces, please, for us.
The question is how to pick up the pieces and who is going to pick up the pieces. And I will talk about the region. Of course, there are pieces in the global system as well. But if we focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict, increasingly, there are 2 points that I don't understand, anybody who didn't learn them by now. One is there is no substitute for a 2-state solution if we are going to have peace, security, stability, prosperity, regional integration, normal relations, coexistence of religions, races, etc. in the Middle East. 2, the 2-state solution will not happen unless we have a leading American role pushing for it. Now, the tension between these 2 facts, let's say, has been with us for the last 4 decades. Hence, the peace process lost its credibility. It is not providing light at the end of the tunnel. Everybody is convinced now that it is meaningless. If we see who the war was, who was fighting in the last 30 months, we have, of course, Israel, we have Hamas, we have Hezbollah, we have the Houthis, we have Iran. All of them are opposed to the 2-state solution. They have a common denominator. They want to make sure that a 2-state solution doesn't become a reality. So there is no way we can move forward if we continue to sidestep or ignore the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people for self-determination. If we want to continue the policies that ignore or sidestep or sugarcoat ignoring or sidestepping this central issue, I don't know why we will expect other results. It will happen again and again and again. More destruction, more war, more hatred. Is there an alternative? Of course there is. And Saudi Arabia and the GCC states and Egypt and Jordan are coming together every time, going all around the world. We convened 2 Arab Islamic Extraordinary Summits in Riyadh. We had the ministerial follow-up committee that went to all the globe from east to west, from north to south. We also are establishing the Global Alliance for implementing the two-state solution. Frankly speaking, I have yet to find any high official from all these countries that tells me we oppose the two-state solution. However, despite this consensus, it is clearly not going to be implemented if we continue this ignoring. The devil always is in the details, but especially regarding where the US position would be, including the next administration. As regarding the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia supports all efforts aimed at establishing peace, security, stability for the objective of regional integration and regional prosperity. As you all know, we have a very ambitious Vision 2030. Similarly, all GCC states are focused on internal development and making life better for coming generations. Egypt, Jordan, other Arab states are also focused on this. This will not be a reality without resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict in a lasting peace in accordance with the international consensus. Any other solution is not a solution. It's continuation of what we are witnessing right now.
Thank you. And Professor Bahut, I would love to ask the same question, but with a specific focus on which actors, with which regional players can help to pick up in the pieces.
You know, when I was trying to gather a few thoughts before coming here on this very interesting title, I mean, picking up the pieces, as you said, sir, I mean, there are so many pieces on the international, let's say, chessboard to be picked up, but I'll try to be selective and I'll think of some that are very immediate and very hot. I think the first, in the list, the menu of pieces to be picked up, I think the first one today and the more dire and the more urgent, and I'm echoing what you just said, is the piece of Palestine itself. Not only the two-state solution, the idea of Palestine. I think that what we have been witnessing for the last year, of course, but more than that, for the last 3-4 decades, is a steady, very systematic and very methodic attempt at liquidating the idea of a Palestinian state, of a Palestinian statehood. I don't want to get into details, 2-state, 1-state, the shape of the state, etc. The idea of a Palestinian entity, a Palestinian statehood is today more than comatose, okay? It's about to be dead, and this is the first piece to be picked up. It has to do with, first of all, how to get out from the rubbles of Gaza, how to reunite the Palestinian body, authority, how to reform it, how to re-put again Palestine on the international agenda, who will put it, who will be the actor, and who will be the other interlocutor. As you said, sir, there's no one today in Israel that is ready to hear and to listen about something called Palestine. And the shift today is going further towards some extremism. I mean, you have today high-level officials, an ambassador in the US and the US ambassador in Israel, who are telling you there's nothing called Palestine. We're not anymore in something technical called the two-state solution and etc. It's about a people, an identity that is erased. This is the first piece to be picked. The second, I'm talking about my country, is now to pick up the pieces of Lebanon. Lebanon is in pieces, is in shambles today. Not only physical destruction, but you are facing today a polity that is very, very deeply broken, very deeply polarized, probably on the verge of many, many problems now that the war has stopped. Problems will probably start to pop up. It's an illusion I would like to have, I mean, to believe that because of the ceasefire, we are now getting into a sort of normal, rosy future in Lebanon. It's not the case. We are heading towards huge problems on the political level, the institutional setup of the country, on the economic level, the reconstruction of the country, not only because of the war, but because of the crisis that has been left also festering for the last 5, if not more, years, and on, let's say, the mental, psychological level with a very severe, very worrying, very grave rise of hatred within the communities and among the communities in Lebanon. This has to be picked up also, and it's a probably very difficult Lebanese, let's say, work to do. The third one, since I'm sitting with Ambassador Peterson and we barely mention it, is to pick up the pieces of Syria. Syria is today in pieces, Mr. Ambassador. We'll talk about it in the closed meeting after that. Syria is today 4 Syrias. There's no Syria. There's the central Syria, which is itself also polarized and torn between Russia and Iran. And then you have the Turkish Syria in the northwest. You have something I don't know how to label in the northeast, which is a sort of condominium between Russia, America, Kurds, etc. And then you have the south of Syria, which is something else. You have an economy that is on the ground. You have a UN Security Council resolution of which you are the custodian, sir, 2254, that is today left completely without any work. I mean, the last Geneva meeting probably dates back to something like a year and a half or 2 years. So you have to pick up these pieces also. And then you have the pieces of the regional order, the regional architecture, as you said. And here the question is, are we going, all of us in the region, to accept easily the idea that this region is today being rebuilt or built or reshaped by fire and blood and etc. in order to build up a sort of, I'm sorry to say it, but a sort of Israeli hegemon, an Israel hegemon in the region, by really redrawing the boundaries, not only the physical boundaries, but the political boundaries of the region to the taste of only one power in the region. Where is the equilibrium of power in the region? This is also a huge question and a huge piece to pick. And last but not least, and this is where we started the conversation, I think the biggest piece today to be picked up internationally is the international order and the rule-based order, this famous or unfamous, or I don't know, I mean, if it ever exists. Today we are probably called to think about that. Has it ever existed, this rule-based order, this liberal-based order that the Bretton Woods era has started when they created the UN? I'm very skeptical today, and this has to be also picked up. And we have to really think about the normative capacity of anything, the UN or other, to dictate new rules of the game internationally. I will end up by echoing what our Saudi friend has said. These are some of the pieces to be picked up, but the question is who will do this work? Who will pick up the pieces? And this is what we were saying in the first round. Today, I don't see candidates to pick up these pieces. The UN is there, but it's impotent and it needs to be rethought. And then you have the superpower, the UN, that is showing every sign of reluctance to pick up the pieces. There is a readiness to play on the pieces, to surf on the pieces, to do transactional things, to patch up things for a while, etc. But this will not do the job. And then you have other contending powers that are looking for a place for themselves, which is, from their point of view, legitimate. The contending power, the middle powers, the rising powers, China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, etc., Saudi Arabia. In such a system, I fear that our region, the Middle East, and the pieces to be picked up in the Middle East is as volatile and in transition as is the international system. And this is why I'm worried for the decade to come.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Professor Gomar, I will ask you about Europe, and again, because especially after September 7 of October, one of the most common expressions, especially in the newsroom, has become double standard. And so could be that double standard, the facing double standard can be and has be the biggest challenge for Europe in that last years.
Thank you, Marta, for this question. You know, I was educated partly in Russia, so the last 2 decades I was told about double standards almost for this sort of obsession every year, and this idea that Europe took sanctions, you know, against North Korea, against Iran, against Russia after annexation of Crimea, after the onslaught in February 2022, and that Europe did not take real sanction against Israel, for instance, with West Bank and so on. So it's a key point. And it's something which has a very powerful effect, especially in the so-called global or transactional south. I prefer to speak about transactional south. It's true also to say that Europeans remain united regarding Ukraine, whatever we said, and whatever it is said, you know, by the information warfare, actually it is united. It is not united on Middle East for different reasons. Let me reverse also this approach of double standards, because I must confess I'm a little bit fed up with that. If you observe, you know, the summit of the BRICS Plus in Kazan, for instance, the United Nations General Secretary attending to this event, which is something interesting because now we have President Putin, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who are prosecuted by international justice, but the General Secretary came to Kazan. And there are many countries which explain all the time that you know, sovereignty, integrity, territorial integrity is at the core of the international system, and who apparently forgot, you know, what happened to Ukraine. So I think that double standard hypocrisy is certainly on the European side, no doubts, but not only, I would say. And it's important also to have that in mind if we try to precisely to pick up pieces and to try to restore what can be restored in a very, very turbulent moment. Let me add one more overall observation. You know, it seems to me that this region, Middle East, reflects something more broad, which is a sort of, I would say, fragmented connectivity. 2 keywords. As soon as you're in the Middle East, especially in Gulf countries, you have a sort of futurist discourse about connectivity. We should be connected. We will be connected. We will invest on that infrastructure, which is a positive step, I think. But you have also this idea of fragmentation. And this keyword of fragmentation, it is now at the core of the, I would say, the general geopolitical scenario for investors and so on. And it's not only, I think, you know, something which is observable, you know, in Middle East. It is something which is observable elsewhere. And the real problem, I finished my first round on that. I think the real problem for all of us is to try to anticipate the new or the continuation of the US attitude, because we will have now a US which said, you know, the so-called globalization, the so-called idea that connectivity will be the main direction, can finish. You know, we'll have a unitarist US, protectionist US. So what does it mean, I would say, globally, and with the consequences for the different regions? And on that, I will finish. I think it will be very, very challenging, not only for Middle East, but maybe more importantly for Europe. It's a way for me to be back to your initial question.
Thank you very much. So thank you to everybody to help us to try to picking up the pieces. I'm sure that there are some pieces still on the ground. Perhaps we have time for a very, very quick round, last quick round. And I will ask to everybody for your opinion about the last, about the agreement, about the ceasefire agreement, and what we can say for the next few hours from your point of view, obviously, very, very quick, because we are 1 minute for each, about the ceasefire in Lebanon and which is what we have to expect for the next few hours. Very quick, what you can say, obviously, from your point of view.
I'm obviously following this from the Syrian perspective.
Yeah, of course.
But I believe for this to be effective, obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done inside of Lebanon. It needs to be a lot of work done with Israelis. And we need to make sure that what the ceasefire in Lebanon is not then leading to an escalation in Syria. And importantly, that we don't lose the focus from Gaza.
Okay.
What we need to see is, of course, the return of the Palestinian leadership to Gaza. We need to see an immediate ceasefire, and we need to see an end to settlement activities on the West Bank. So these are three things that needs to happen in parallel. And when it comes to Syria, there's so much at stake, but I will leave that to another session. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. From you.
Well, of course, everybody welcomes the ceasefire, and it is badly needed, of course. And one very positive sign is that already some displaced families from southern Lebanon are returning to southern Lebanon. I don't know if they are optimistic, but at least they have to. They have no choice except to be optimistic and try to return to their homes. And this leads me to how we can see some optimism, some opportunity in all these horrible crises. And I think we have to remember that the deterrence, the whole deterrence strategy of both Israel and Iran has collapsed. In Israel, October 7 itself was a collapse of the deterrence. In Iran, what they call forward defense, or whatever you want to call it, and instead of deterring attacks on Iran, needed Iran help to survive. And Iran paid a heavy price by weakening state institutions in all these countries that it had militias on. And this is where the airspace was used to attack Iran. So in the final analysis, it might be a wake-up call. There is some opportunity for a better future for all of us. We are working hard to achieve it, and we need the support of our European friends and, of course, of our American friends and the international community. But by having an opportunity, it doesn't mean it will happen by itself. It will require all of us working together to achieve it. In Lebanon, I see an opportunity that the country can regain its sovereignty, its institutions, can get rid of the very long disease that it witnessed in its history.
Thank you. And for you, Professor, especially for Lebanon in that moment.
Yeah, I'll try to be very quick. First of all, of course, everybody welcomes this with relief, but with also caution, because the mechanism itself is still very mined. I mean, there are many things that has to be monitored very carefully. First of all, the interim period of 60 days, where in the meantime, many things could happen that could torpedo the deal. Second, the monitoring mechanism, France, US, Great Britain, others, etc. So it needs a lot of international goodwill and acceptance by both parties to play the game. Third, of course, there are the pending questions that are not resolved by the agreement. It's a ceasefire agreement. It's not a definitive agreement. The issue of the border, the issue of the weapons, etc., which leads me to the second part that is probably the most important, the Lebanese domestic, let's say, menu of work. I think the first and foremost and immediate and most urgent thing to do now in Lebanon is to elect a president of the republic. It's to fill and close the institutional hole and vacuum, not only because it's an institutional piece in the system, but because only a president of the republic can have the moral authority and capacity to put everybody in Lebanon around the table to think about the very deep, the very existential issues in the country. The issue of strategy of defense and the weapons, the issue of reconstruction and economic recovery and economic growth in the future. And last but not least, and probably the most difficult, the issue of the social contract that is still, hopefully, I hope so, uniting the Lebanese. I think this is the most immediate thing to do. Of course, return of displaced very quickly, reconstruction, recovery, etc., will follow, but this is the cornerstone of the construction. And I hope that my fellow countrymen, the politicians that are ruling this country, will very quickly understand that there is something very quick to be done, and sometimes at the cost of their own egoism and self-interest.
Thank you. And for you, Professor, the same question.
And very quickly, because I see that we are running time.
Sorry for that.
No. I think that there is something very challenging for the United Nations system, either in Lebanon tomorrow and possibly in Ukraine the day after, I don't know when. It is a question of having peacekeepers and having peacekeepers provided by countries which will be able to accept possible losses. I stop on that, but I think it's very critical now also in terms of a post-conflict situation to have real peacekeeping forces.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody. And so.
Really appreciate your strong support.
Merci, Martin. No, merci, Martin.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Merci, Thomas. Thank you very much. It was good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
No.